Hello, everyone. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to say good morning or good afternoon. I guess officially good afternoon. We're a little past noon. My name's Gary Barnes. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I am being joined by Brenda Allen with Reliant Behavioral Health, who is sort of my technical backup, and so she will be reading messages, um, feeding me questions, things like that, telling me if people are having problems hearing me or seeing my screen. So do let us know if you're having any problems with any aspect of this, or if you have any questions. All of you are muted, which makes it always a little odd for me. I'm sort of talking into a vacuum. I don't know whether your heads are nodding or you're falling asleep or you're shaking your fist in anger at something I've said. Um, so if you love it, thank you. And if you're shaking your fist in anger, I humbly apologize, and would love to hear any feedback that you have as we go on. It's kind of hard for me to talk and read feedback at the same time, but we'll see what we can do. So, like I said, I'm Gary Barnes. Probably more than I'm a licensed clinical social worker. More than anything else, I have a lot of interaction with clients, I guess I call them, or you might call them patients, but I call people clients, individuals, couples, families in my office. And I have also done a lot of work in the workplace, been to many workplaces and sat in with troubled work groups, met with supervisors and managers who are struggling with employee issues, sort of the whole manner of things. So I have a pretty good grasp on what the workplace is like. And one of the things that I know is that we have 98 people currently attending this webinar, and there's probably a great variety of workplaces that you all are in. So I will use examples, but I may not quite hit your workplace setting enough. If you work for a large employer and you're like a middle manager or a supervisor, your experience is going to be 180 degrees from somebody who works in a company where there's 50 or 100 people, and you know everybody well. I've worked with companies where everybody knows everybody, and they know everybody's children and parents too, and that makes um, supervision more interesting. Okay, so I'm going to advance my slides. So today we kind of have a collection of goals. I'm going to try to give you some essential skills for building effective teams. We're going to learn ideas for managing differences in the workplace, learn ideas for improving your communication with employees, and then talk about confidence. And we're going to do all of that in about 50 minutes or so. So that means we're not going to cover anything in great depth, but I'm going to give you just some ideas. And then at the end, you're going to see a reading list or a reading or watch list. I have a couple of websites that you can go to as well. And I'm going to encourage you, I'm starting now, I'm going to encourage you to go take whatever you got today. If you can walk away with one or two things today that are new ideas for you, you won't be particularly skilled in whatever that one or two things are. So just take it and try to build on it after today's session. All righty, here we go. So this is one model of many for thinking about a well-functioning team. And let me go ahead to the next slide and you'll understand. So I borrowed this from Patrick Lencioni, one of my favorite authors. He's a good writer. He tends to write books that are parables. You know, so he tells a story about a team and weaves his ideas into that. And this book was written, gosh, probably 10 years ago, at least, maybe now. And it was a home run. It's a wonderful book, well written, and gives just a basic overview for what is required in a team. He always writes books from the negative perspective, so he's got the 5 dysfunctions of a team. And so you could see on the left-hand side of my screen, it says inattention to results, et cetera, et cetera. And it builds like a pyramid. So the idea is that you have to start at the bottom. So you start with trust, then once you have that established, you deal with conflict, commitment, accountability, and results. It's a very neat looking model, and you know and I know that nothing ever works very neatly when you try to put it into practice in the workplace. But it can give you, you know, it puts some ideas in your head, and I'm going to go through a couple of those ideas. And you see on this slide the role of the leader. So this is you, I assume. Most of you should be the leader. Um, uh, Being vulnerable to build trust, demanding debate, forcing clarity and closure, confronting difficult issues, and focusing on collective outcomes. Okay, so now I'm going back to my previous slide. So to me, I do like this. The components of a well-functioning team are building trust, managing conflict and differences effectively, generating commitment to shared goals. And then I am introducing a new idea here: power, responsibility, and accountability. If you think of it like a triangle, the 3 of those things should all be in balance. And probably some of you are frustrated because you feel like you don't have those in balance. You may have a boss who doesn't give you, in your view, enough power, but gives you the responsibility and the accountability. So I think probably most of you, maybe all of us, have been in that situation a time or two where we felt like we had the responsibility and the accountability, or at least the responsibility, and didn't have the power, and that can be, you know, pretty frustrating. So as a leader, you want to make sure that your team members have those 3 things in balance. And then, of course, focusing on results. All right, let's move on. So taking each of these things in order and pretty quickly, of course, we're starting with building trust, or I also use the word rapport. So by creating trust, here are just some of my ideas, and I hope these make sense to you and that you like them. Show others that you care about them by listening to their concerns and helping them develop solutions, by being vulnerable, which Lencioni calls the foundation of trust. It's admitting that you make mistakes, that you get things wrong, that you might not be right, that you have issues, that you have emotions, you know, things like that. It's what I call the sloppiness of being a human. You let some of that show. Not, you know, I'm not talking about being unprofessional, but I'm talking about letting your team know that you also are human tends to build trust. And then, of course, you want to be predictable and consistent. Creating positives in your relationships, what we call the emotional bank account. We borrow this from the marital research. If you have a 5-to-1 ratio of positives to negatives in your emotional bank account with your spouse, or in this case with a coworker, it definitely applies to friends, to your kids, other family members. You know, basically think about creating positives so that when there are withdrawals from the bank account, you still have a healthy balance of positives. Some of you, by the way, have employees who work remotely, and it's harder, in my experience, to build positives with employees who you don't see or have regular interactions with, because we build positives in little ways, like what we call small talk in the workplace, right? Can really be a good way to build a connection with people, and sometimes we don't have that with people who work remotely, or also people, if you have people who work for you who work different shifts. So do the best you can with that. Healthy communication means managing conflict. So we're into the second part of that pyramid. So once you establish trust, I'm sure one slide on trust, and you've already done that. So now we've got, that was a joke, by the way. I have a dry sense of humor. Healthy communication means managing conflict. So when people say they are not communicating or don't communicate well, often what they're talking about is the way that they deal with conflict. And I love this about this 5 dysfunctions model, and I want you to love it too. Conflict is, of course, if you've ever been to a communication training or a conflict training, you may have heard the adage that conflict is normal, and that's true. The more time you spend with somebody, the more you interact, the more things you have to deal with, the more likely that conflict is to happen. So we know that conflict is inevitable. But what Patrick Lencioni says, and I found this to be true, is that conflict is necessary and important. You sort of want people to speak up and say when they're not happy. You want them to do it in a constructive way, and you want to be able to move on when you need to. But in general, you do want people to be willing to speak against, something that they think is not right or that they don't like. This is certainly true, by the way, and I'm sure a lot of you do customer service. Probably all of you do customer service in one way or another. And we want customers to complain too, right? We don't want them to just go away. Me as the presenter in this webinar, I'd rather you tell me if there's something you don't like about what I'm saying or doing than silently go away and not be happy. And this becomes even more important when you're working as a team. So Lencioni coined this term, unfiltered debate. And that sounds really scary to many of us. But remember, it's around tasks and goals to clarify and gain commitment. And I am going to talk in a few minutes about how to establish some ground rules for respect. But the idea is that you want people, initially, when you're talking about a problem or a growth area in your business, you want them to feel like they can be at least somewhat unfiltered, and as long as they're on task, to talk about what they think or feel. Okay, and then we want to deal with conflicts as needed. Again, being vulnerable and admitting mistakes, listening and observing for signs of unresolved conflict. So sometimes you have to unearth or bring conflict to the surface. You could feel it in the room, and rather than just move on, you can bring it out. You see this in meetings. When meetings are boring, often they're boring because people aren't speaking up. They're feeling and thinking things, but they're not saying them. So when you have silence in a meeting, as a leader, that may be a time to try to surface or bring up areas where there may be conflict. And there's a goal of dialogue, which I may or may not have time to get into today. And then managing conflicts means being educated about diversity, having respect for differences, using inclusive language, and we'll talk more about that later. But again, back to trust, if you're creating trust and safety, and then if you have trust and safety, then people will speak up more, then obviously diversity is a piece of that. All right, once you have unfiltered debate, then you want to gain commitment. So you don't want to have endless debate. You want to be able to make decisions as a team, or if you're in a structure where the leader gets to make a decision with input, then you want to make that decision. So how do we do that? Gaining commitment. Let me just put all of this stuff out here. So clarity and consistency, being clear about what you expect, what your expectations are up front, helping make job roles and tasks understandable, communicating directly and asking for the same, clarifying at the end of discussions what agreements were made or not made, and following through on commitments. There's a phrase, I don't know, is it in my next slide? No, I don't have it. So let me go back. We call it disagree and commit is my favorite phrase about commitment. So when you're, consensus is really hard, and most groups don't try to function on a consensus model at all times. So that means you're often making decisions that not everybody agrees with. So some people on the team, we want to do what we call disagree and commit. So you may not agree with it, but you commit to it, and then there's going to be a follow-up. Follow-up, how are we doing? How did what we decided to do work? And so people will buy in to commitments, even if they disagree with them, if they believe that they'll be able to have input down the road if things are not working out the way the team expected. All right. Oh, there it is. There's disagree and commit. I just didn't let the thing scroll out. So your work habits and behaviors speak louder than any words. So if you show a commitment to your work and to the mission of your organization, that's going to show up in your employees. Showing gratitude helps build commitment. By the way, behaviorally, the opposite, putting people down, pointing out mistakes over and over again, tends to deflate commitment. That may seem counterintuitive sometimes, but showing gratitude for what people do really helps people feel energized and more committed to their work. I just started doing some work for an organization as a contractor where they have what are called high fives. I've never seen this, but anyone at any time can send out a high five. It's sent via email, and it's a little graphic of a hand, like you're giving somebody a high five, and then they say who they're giving the high five to and why. I thought that was a great example of showing gratitude in an organization that's a little bigger, more spread out, and it sort of builds gratitude into their system as something people get used to. All right. Oops. I had to understand team goals and make them a priority. All right. Accountability comes on the heels of commitment. Are you following how these things fall in line? So just to go back to the beginning, we start with trust. Once you have trust, then you can have unfiltered debate around and healthy conflict. Once you have healthy conflict and people can get their viewpoints and ideas out, then it encourages commitment. I may not have said that clearly enough, because if you feel like you were able to say what you wanted to say, if you had an opinion about a subject, then you may not agree, but you may then hopefully be able to commit. So then once you commit, then it's like, okay, what are we all committing to? And what follows from that is holding myself and everyone else accountable for the agreements we made and for performance. And ideally, we want this second thing, peer accountability, where we're holding each other accountable. Unfortunately, in a lot of organizations, that doesn't happen, and then it gets left to the supervisor or manager to be what we would call the heavy, right? The one that has to deliver the bad news. And of course, as a supervisor, you do have to take responsibility for managing performance, and specifically when people are not living up to their standards or agreements. But ideally, it's done peer-to-peer. Yeah, so, but you do it by tying back to team goals, as well as tying back to agreements you've made individually with people. And then celebrating, so I didn't do the results. No, I did do results. Hang on a second. I went here to, I'm trying to remember how I set up my slides. I apologize. I haven't practiced this training, this webinar. So here are some ideas about accountability. And this comes from the EAP. RBH has a supervisor manual that you can request, and it's sort of built on this idea of universal job expectations. So the idea is that each of your employees has probably has a job duties, specific job duties that they have to adhere to. But then all employees have these universal expectations, and those often aren't spelled out in individual job descriptions. So we've laid out these, how many are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 of them. And if you go to the supervisor section of the RBH website, you can see this list and the description of each one. And there's a sheet that has universal expectations on one side and examples of on the other side of the sheet. So it's divided in half of language you can use when people are not living up to those expectations. So this is very helpful when you're having to give feedback to an employee who's not measuring up in some way. This is an old EAP idea that most of the time, or much of the time, employees that you're struggling with are doing a fine job in terms of their executing the technical aspects of their job. These things on this list are not usually the technical aspects of their job. And so it gives you a way to articulate what the issues are you're having with an employee. So I put this up here to help you with the idea of accountability. All right, now let's talk about collective outcomes. These are just some ideas. Having a scoreboard. Are you able to think of your work and what you're trying to accomplish as a team in terms of a scoreboard? You know, can you have numbers or at least phrases for what you're shooting for? And do you have a scoreboard that people can see? It really depends on your work as to whether you're able to quantify that. If you're doing sales and marketing, usually in sales or often in sales, it becomes a little easier to measure. You can measure dollars brought in or customers brought in or number of contacts you've made with customers, things like that. If you're working in social services or a lot of healthcare, sometimes this is much harder to do, but I'd encourage you to try to do it. And then review progress on goals regularly with the entire team and reward individuals based on team goals where you can and collective success. And then celebrate results. Okay? All right, we're going to the second part of our presentation, managing differences. So here are some ideas for you. I don't have an example of this first thing, but we have them available. There probably is something on the RBH website, but you can have respect-based expectations and guidelines for your organization. And many of you probably already have this. So I would encourage you to make sure you're reviewing that. Then we have the universal expectations, which I just went through. We also have the emotional bank account, which I just went through with you. The idea of the 5-to-1 ratio, you remember that? And the PSO versus NSO. This is a technical phrase, positive sentiment override versus negative sentiment override. What does that even mean? If you have a 5-to-1 ratio in your emotional bank account, then you're going to have positive sentiment override. That means if you screw up or make a mistake or say something mildly offensive, the other person is going to not be very upset about that, or they're going to be less upset than they would be if you didn't have that 5-to-1 ratio. I hope that makes sense to everyone. Positive, it's called sentiment override. Here's my classic example. If I am picking my spouse up from work and I'm 20 minutes late and she's standing out in the rain waiting for me and she gets in the car, her reaction to me is going to be based on this sentiment override. If in general I have been doing well with her, showing her a lot of respect, doing many things to take care of her, generally I'm not late, etc., she may get in the car and say, "Where the heck were you?" and be angry for, a minute or two. But pretty quickly she's going to get over it. I'm going to offer my lame excuse. She's going to either accept that or not, but it's not going to feel like that big of a deal. On the other hand, if I'm 20 minutes late picking her up and I've been neglecting the relationship, I've been late many times, I've been showing that I really don't care in many other ways, it could ruin the whole evening or ruin the rest of the week that I was late. So that, I think, is a really good illustration of sentiment override, positive or negative. And of course, this matters when we talk about managing differences, because difference means you don't see eye to eye, that you have different ideas about how to do things. Differences could mean different values. It could mean a different spiritual background, different cultural background. It could be I'm an introvert, you're an extrovert. I'm concrete, you're heads in the clouds. All kinds of ways that we are different. And so you can see how this emotional bank account is just so critical. And then I hope you could see how implementing, having expectations and guidelines to follow also really sets the stage for being able to manage differences in a healthy way. And then having healthy boundaries. And we could have a whole class on how to keep healthy boundaries. But I don't really know what else to say about that. There's so much to be said. So let me just go on for now. So keeping healthy boundaries, I decided to put up a couple of slides about just how you communicate. So be a powerful communicator to work with difference. Take responsibility for your part or any part of an issue, a problem, which is that back to the vulnerability thing. Be soft on the person, but firm and consistent on problem behavior. And when I've done supervisor coaching around managing an employee with performance problems, this is what I always say. And I have yet to see a reason why it doesn't make sense to be soft on a person, but firm and consistent on problem behavior. I'm not talking about being direct or indirect. In general, I think being direct is better, but direct is different than being hard on a person. You don't ever want to intentionally put somebody down. Putting people down moves them in the opposite direction. It deflates their sense of self. It deflates their motivation. It deflates their sense of teamwork. So soft on the person. Obviously, listening is critical. I know you all know that. I know that. Even as a counselor, sometimes it's hard for me to listen. There's so many things I want to say to people. And then ask specifically for what people want and when they want it. Investigate complaints. Even if you don't think a complaint has a lot of validity, sometimes it just adds to the sense of trust and safety if you know you're going to take people seriously. Be willing to be wrong, or at least accept that multiple things can be true at the same time. Be willing to talk clearly about your own feelings as appropriate. And we call this authenticity. I'll have a little bit more about that later. This is also something you can do work on your own on. Soft startup and repair attempts. These are marital terms. You could probably tell I'm a couples counselor. Soft startups versus harsh startups. So you want to think about if you have to deliver bad news or have a difficult conversation with an employee or employees, you want to think about how you're starting that conversation. You know, and it can be simple things like, there's something I want to talk to you about. Is now a good time, or when would be a good time? Um, uh, Personally, I don't like, maybe you've heard about like the compliment sandwich. That would be, I guess, technically a soft startup. I think it feels a little manipulative. I've actually been on the receiving end of a compliment sandwich. And for those of you who don't know what that is, you compliment, then you say the negative, then you compliment again. If you can deliver it without it sounding contrived and like it's something you learned at a Fred Pryor seminar, then I think you can get away with it. But that is an example of a soft startup, would be saying, you know, I know you're really working hard, and I've really appreciated that you've been working hard on this issue or this issue. And so that does count as a soft startup. And then repair attempts are the attempts you make when you see a conversation going awry, to sort of bring things back to, you know, to a more, a less charged base. And often that's taking responsibility for something, you know. Sometimes it's noticing that somebody's not having a good reaction to something and asking them to say more about that. Sometimes it's just taking a time out and giving you and the other person a chance to calm down, as long as you come back to it. And then appreciate and take advantage of the differences among coworkers, cultural, gender, age, life experiences. I really encourage each of you to take a few minutes here and there to really think about this, because somebody's gender or age or life experience or culture sometimes can seem like a pain in the butt. You know, oh, we can't do this because of, you know, somebody will be upset, or you know, a classic one that older people often work more slowly, but they're more deliberate, or they don't have the technical knowledge about computers. So you have to challenge yourself to remember, well, what do they bring to the table? Because of their age or because of their life experience, what do they bring? Not only what ways does it cause problems. So, you know, this requires an intention on your part, because differences at first often feel like they're just creating more problems. All right, focus on strengths. I love this. And some of you may have done some training on this. I trained in a model that some of you know called Strengths Finder. and I have a reference to that at the end here for those of you who haven't done it. It's a list of, I believe it's 34 strengths. You go online, you take the test, you find out what your strengths are. Depending on how much you pay, it'll either spit back your top 5, or if you pay more money, I think you can get all 34 and see which ones you're stronger at. But the idea is based on this, that research shows that if you focus on your natural talents, you're actually going to be more successful. And as a leader, you're going to have more influence on your colleagues and people who work for you if you understand their strengths and play to their strengths. So a natural byproduct is that people feel supported and encouraged for who they are rather than being judged for who they aren't. I found this super helpful. I like to do team interventions, go into a workplace where people aren't getting along. And there's one strength called strategic, and I really wanted to be strategic. So that would be when I go in, people talk about what the problems are, and I'm sitting there calculating, what's going on, and this is what I'm going to do next. It turns out that I'm not a strategic person. My lead strength, it turns out, is empathy. And I have a couple others that work as well. So then I started going to these work group interventions I was doing and using empathy as the way I was dealing, and I still do that, the way I deal with a work group. So I'm really good at paying attention to how people are feeling, and so I go with that. You so-and-so appear to be having an issue with this. Can you tell us more about that? Those kind of interventions. And it really turns out to work well when I play to my strength. So that's an example, a personal example of how you can use strengths. Hang on. So have we had any questions yet, Brenda?
No. No questions yet.
Okay. So I'm going to go on now to the confidence section. I seem to be moving along pretty well, actually. Right, confidence. I love talking about confidence because it's a fun topic to talk about. I talk to clients about it all the time, and I get furious head nods. There's like a secret that we don't know, and the secret is that nobody really is very confident a lot of the time. The difference between people who show confidence and those who don't is that people who are confident sort of have learned to deal with not knowing how to do something. It relates a little bit to, I was looking for a statistic on this. I couldn't find it. I didn't look really hard. But maybe you've heard there's a gender difference here, that men and women, if they're applying for a new job, that women believe, and I'm not going to get the statistic right, but women believe that they have to have like 95% of what is needed for the job before they even want to apply for it, whereas men tend to, it's more like 40 or 50% or maybe 60%. Like I said, I don't know the number, but much less. They don't feel like they have to know everything about the job in order to apply for it, which is related to confidence. They figure that they'll figure out how to do it. They'll learn how to do it. So there is often a gender difference in the area of confidence, but not always. So then, if you think about this, the idea then is you never start by feeling confident. You only gain confidence by doing, by gaining experience. I'm doing, I don't know how many webinars I've done. Brenda might have an idea. 20? I don't know, 10, 20?
At least 10.
Yeah, so I'm not, and I've done hundreds of trainings. So, I have a little bit of anxiety before every training, but I now know that I can do it. And one of the things I know, by the way, is I always choose material that I know fairly well, because that will build my confidence as well. But, that isn't the way the world works. You are challenged to do things that you don't know how to do well and don't like to do. And by the way, one of the areas where this comes up really a lot for people is when you're dealing with an employee with significant performance problems. We believe that if you're a supervisor and you have an employee that you really have to deal with, if you know what I mean, you're really going to have to monitor their performance, possibly write them up, possibly, God forbid, terminate. We're talking about maybe 5% of your employees, maybe 10%. If you're in an unlucky job environment, it might be more than that. But most of us, we just don't get experience dealing with employees with problems. So you don't ever get a chance to feel confident. You have to meet with somebody, you have to give them bad news, they're going to be angry with you. You never get used to that because you don't deal with it frequently enough. And so what do? We avoid it. And if you avoid dealing with these things, then you definitely will never gain mastery or confidence. So again, you don't start by feeling confident, and then the challenge is learning to manage fear and discomfort. So that's your challenge. How do you manage fear and discomfort? So as I say at the end of this slide, confidence is really about learning to live with and manage fear and avoidance behaviors. Okay. All right. So here's a polling question, your only polling question. This is to see if you're alive, and also I'm interested in what people will think. So the poll's now open. When you're facing a new or uncomfortable situation where you're not feeling confident and are feeling fear, which of these will help? Pushing the fear away with positive and using positive thinking, listening to the fear and avoiding the situation, or inviting the fear because it can't hurt you. Let's see how you all answer this. Are you going to show the answers, Brenda, or can you?
I don't think that the answers pop up. I can read them aloud. 58% voted for 1, push the fear away, positive thinking. 4% voted for listen to the fear, avoid situation, and 51% voted for invite the fear because it can't hurt you.
All right, great. Okay, that's probably about what I would expect. So I may have made number 2 too obvious that wasn't the right one because I said avoid the situation. I'm sure that all of us do this to a lesser or greater degree. So raise your hand if you're in a private situation. If you do number 2, sometimes. I'm guessing that's all of us sometimes. Number 1, to me, is sort of the most common misperception of how to deal with fear, is pushing it away. Now, positive thinking is better than negative thinking, right? And that on its own is not necessarily the problem. It's pushing the fear away that can be a problem, because we want to do, so number 3 is in my view, the correct answer. And you may argue, if we had a discussion, some of you would talk about number 1 and how you use that to your advantage. And I get that. I've heard that argument. But let me explain why I'm talking about inviting the fear. The idea is that when you feel fear, anxiety, especially when it's about something that you are going to have to do, if you try to push it away, make it go away, you're tending to give it more of your energy. And if you can't make it go away, then you're stymied and you feel like you can't move forward unless it goes away. So by drawing more attention to it, sometimes you make it worse. It's called the white bear effect, I think. It was a study of college students where they asked them to um, think about, for the next 5 minutes, think about anything that you want, but under no circumstances are you allowed to think about white bears. And then after the 5 minutes, they asked them how many times they thought about white bears. And of course, when prompted in that way, you think about white bears all the time. So it's that principle that when you tell your mind not to think about something or to push it away, it actually encourages your mind to think about it more. By inviting the fear in, you're sort of uh, knocking out its punch. You're saying, "Come on in," and I can't help but quote Russ Harris, and I quote he's at the end of this training too. The book is called The Confidence Gap. One of my favorites. I listen to it if you like audiobooks. It's funny, and this is one of the places where it's funny. He says, so you want to invite the fear in. It's knocking on the door. You open the door. You invite it in. Hello, fear. What would you like to do today? Do you want to run my heart through its paces? All right, let's have a go at that. And it's so he wants you to have that kind of an attitude. And then he says, literally, it's not actually going to hurt you. And if you remind yourself, it's not going to hurt you. And in the case of confidence, now that I'm hopefully building a case here for you, it's actually normal. Feeling fear and anxiety is actually normal. I had a client tell me the other day, it was interesting, that she feels fear a lot and it stops her from doing stuff. But then she said, but you know, I'm really a good singer. And when I do karaoke, I always feel this fear before I get on stage, but I know I'm going to knock it out of the park. So I thought that was interesting. She's feeling the same fear, but judging it differently. So if you begin to judge your fear as normal and sort of let it come in without letting it rule you, and there are other things that you could do. So let's see, I think, yeah, here's my slide that I just threw this in last night. So remind yourself that feeling fear and anxiety and not feeling confident are understandable and normal, particularly if you're doing something you've never done, or it's a challenge, or it's hard to do, you know, there's going to be conflict, et cetera, or you're in front of a large group, right? And then here's how you invite the fear in. You can notice where it is, what it's saying to you, remember and remind yourself that it can't hurt you. And finally, if any of you can remember this, this is one of the most powerful interventions there is in my mind, separating thoughts from reality. We think, we are thinking machines. Our thoughts, our mind is kind of like talk radio. We're just blabbering away in our minds over and over again, one thought after another. The problem is that we forget that thoughts are just thoughts, and we get what we call hooked. And by the way, Russ Harris talks about this as well. So when you get hooked, you forget that a thought is just a thought, and it becomes true. You know, so you might say, "Oh, this guy's really going to be mad at me." And if you forget that that's just a thought, then you're going to start experiencing that guy being mad at you, and it hasn't even happened yet. If you can remember that it's a thought, then you can ask yourself, is it a helpful thought or an unhelpful thought? So that guy's going to be mad at me. You know, is that helpful or not helpful? Well, not really helpful. It's a little helpful. I have to prepare for that, but it's not helpful because, now I'm starting to get upset about it already. It's possible they might not be upset, or I might be able to frame it in a way that they may not get upset at me. That wasn't a great example, but there are other ones that we could use. All right, we're getting near the end of our hour. So here are some other ideas. I pulled these from an article I read by this man, Jack Zenger, who's an organizational consultant. Seemed like a pretty smart guy. Focus on strengths you possess and your achievements rather than what you don't do well. Look sharp. I like this. Pay attention to your appearance. If you feel like you look good, then other people will judge you as being more confident, and you'll feel more confident. Now, sometimes it isn't about looking sharp. It's about feeling comfortable. So dress and present yourself in a way where you feel okay. Don't wear something that doesn't feel right on you, or you're not sure what people are going to think. Wear something that you look good in, and that kind of thing. So that's more what I'm going for here. It's more the external generates an internal response. And by the way, that's what I'm saying here. Intentional optimism and general happiness. So your outward behavior changes your inner feelings, and we know this. If you smile, it changes how you feel inside. That's got a name. It's the something effect. I don't remember what it is now, but it's been measured that smiling will change how you feel about yourself and your world inside. All right, posture, really important. Pull yourself up and stand straight if you notice yourself slouching, put your shoulders back, your chest out, really makes you feel differently. Be proactive and engage others by asking questions. Asking questions is always a fine way to interact with people. All right, so I'm at the end of the training, except now I'm going to talk about what I want you to do next. Any growth area that you've identified today will require intentional action on your part. So an intention is when you plan deliberate action that you commit to. It's not something that's going to come naturally. I'm going to meditate for 5 minutes every day. That could be an intention. I may not do it, and I may have to set up some reminders or something like that so that I'll do it. But it's not going to come naturally. I'm not going to just start doing it. And then be attached to the intention, not to the outcome. This is really important. So I'm going to say hello to everyone I meet today, or I'm going to smile at everyone I meet today. That doesn't mean that everybody's going to smile back, or that everybody's now going to be nice to you. So I get attached to my smiling at everybody, but I don't get attached to expecting a particular result out of that. Okay. Oops. And part of this is your zone. So you can think of your world as having 3 zones. The comfort zone is where you love to be. You know it's familiar, you're confident, you feel good. The growth zone is where we want to be. It's a little bit outside your comfort zone. It's when you need to develop intentions. And it's going to cause you a little fear and anxiety. The panic zone is also where we don't want to be. So you don't want to push yourself to try something that pushes you so far out that you freak out. That's not good, because freaking out will lead to never, ever, 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 ever trying it again. So you want to try to move into your growth zone. So my encouragement to you today is set some intentions for yourself to move into your growth zone, and try to do that. And when you've incorporated this new thing and now it's in your comfort zone, add something else. Be a learner. You may not be great at all aspects of managing your team members. None of us are. Be willing to reach out for help. Get a coach or a mentor. A mentor, as I learned it, is somebody that has some understanding of your work, but doesn't work directly with you. So probably not somebody who, not your supervisor, um, or maybe not even somebody on your team. It could be somebody on your team, but somebody who has a lot of experience, sort of understands what you do, and you could ask them, will you be my mentor? And you meet, have lunch once a month or whatever, and you give them specific permission to teach you, give you feedback. So you say, I have this employee and this is what I've done. And your mentor says, I wouldn't have done it that way. I'd do it this way. It's different than a friend. A friend would say, well, at least you really tried. Friends are like the rah-rah team. A mentor you're hiring to give you really more specific feedback, even sometimes negative but constructive. You can get some additional training. You can watch a TED Talk. Hopefully all of you know what a TED Talk is. These are online. They're less than 20 minutes, so you're not committing a lot of time on topics that are of interest to you. Just pick anything you're interested in and search for a TED Talk, and there probably is one. And you can also call the EAP. It's free to you. You can call as many times as you want. You can get a little bit of coaching from a clinical person at the EAP for managing problems. All right, we're almost out of time. I think I made it to the finish line. So if you have any other questions, I'll see if I can answer them in the last minute that we have. What do we have? Do we have any questions?
We do have one question, yeah. They're wondering who the author for Confidence Gap is.
Oh, okay. So here I'm showing the last slide. And the author is Russ Harris. He wrote The Confidence Gap. He also wrote The Happiness Trap, and he's written a couple of other books. He practices a kind of therapy that's called ACT, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, and so he uses that model in this book. But he's, like I said, I find him entertaining. He's practical, and positive. So, yeah, I would highly recommend that. And then let me go through this with you. So I talked about Patrick Lencioni. He's got much newer books. You could read anything by him. I think it'd probably be good. I didn't get to talk about Crucial Conversations. It's a model that I use when I talk about dealing with conflict, and it's one of many models for dealing with conversations in the workplace. It's specific to the workplace. Brene Brown, probably many of you have heard of. Her TED Talks are amazing, but she's also written books. Her subject matter is shame, vulnerability, authenticity. It's great stuff. It really is, and can help you be a better person, a better spouse, a better parent, a better friend, and a better supervisor. And I mentioned The Confidence Gap. These are the books I would recommend on strengths. I love this book, Put Your Strengths to Work. But the second book, The Strengths Finder, is the one where you'll actually get the test and learn what your strengths are. Marcus Buckingham, I think, had a falling out with the people who do the Strengths Finder, so now he can't use their test anymore. But he's a smart guy, and this book of all of them really, I thought, was the most practical. So there you go. And then Kristen Neff is the self-compassion queen, who helps us be less hard on ourselves, more self-accepting, and always a good resource for people. All right. Any other questions?
No, we don't have any other questions. We will be sending out the PowerPoint following the webinar.
Okay. Everybody will be getting a copy of the presentation, and feel free to send an email or a message to us. If there's anything I can answer or respond to, I'd be happy to do that. Thank you all so much for attending. I really appreciate it, and I hope you got something out of it. Have a good day.